The sun beat down mercilessly as Elizabeth Mason squinted at the small cluster of wooden buildings in the distance. Her hands tightened on the reins of the tired mule pulling their wagon. The creature was as exhausted as she felt after weeks of difficult travel. In the back of the wagon, her two children dozed fitfully, their small bodies swaying with each bump and dip in the rough trail. "Samuel, Margaret, wake up," Elizabeth called softly. "We're almost there." 10-year-old Samuel stirred first, rubbing his eyes before scrambling to kneel beside his mother on the wagon seat. His younger sister Margaret, just 7 years old, moved more slowly, her dark blonde hair tangled from sleep. "Is that it, Ma? Is that where Cousin William lives?" Samuel asked, pointing toward the settlement ahead. Elizabeth nodded, trying to summon a smile for her children. "That's Whispering Pines. Your father's cousin should be waiting for us." She didn't share her worries with the children. The last letter from William had arrived 6 months ago, before her husband Daniel fell ill with fever on the trail, before she had to bury him in an unmarked grave beside the Oregon Trail, before she had to decide whether to turn back east or continue west with 2 young children and dwindling supplies. The mention of their father made both children quiet. The wound was still fresh, barely 3 months old. Elizabeth felt the familiar ache in her chest but pushed it away. There would be time for grief later. Now, she needed to be strong. The settlement grew larger as they approached. Whispering Pines was smaller than Elizabeth had imagined from William's letters, which had painted a picture of a thriving frontier town. Instead, she counted perhaps 20 buildings, most looking hastily constructed. A few people paused in their work to watch the wagon roll in, their faces showing mild curiosity but little welcome. "Which house is Cousin William's?" Margaret asked, her small voice betraying her uncertainty. Before Elizabeth could answer, a tall man with a thick beard stepped out from what appeared to be the general store. He stared at their wagon with narrowed eyes, before recognition slowly dawned on his face. "Elizabeth?" he called. "Elizabeth Mason?" She pulled the wagon to a stop. "William, is that you?" The man who approached looked only vaguely like the younger cousin she remembered from back east. This William Mason was weathered, with hard lines around his mouth and eyes that didn't soften, even as he smiled. "Well, I'll be." "You actually made it," he said, his tone suggesting surprise rather than pleasure. His eyes darted to the children, then back to Elizabeth. "Where's Daniel?" Elizabeth swallowed hard. "Daniel didn't make it. Fever took him near Fort Laramie." William's face showed a flash of something, pity perhaps or calculation, before settling into a solemn expression. "Sorry to hear that. Tough country out here." An uncomfortable silence followed until a woman emerged from the store. She was thin, with sharp features and hair pulled back so tightly it seemed to stretch her skin. "William, who is it?" she asked, her voice carrying across the dusty street. "It's my cousin's widow and her young ones," William answered. "Remember I told you they might be coming? Though I expected Daniel would be with them." The woman, William's wife Isabel, Elizabeth presumed, didn't bother hiding her displeasure. Her lips pressed into a thin line as she looked over the travel-worn family. "Well," she said finally, "I suppose you'd better come in then." The next 2 weeks were a lesson in unwelcome hospitality. William and Isabel had a small cabin with just enough room for themselves and their teenage son Patrick, who regarded his newly arrived relatives with open resentment. Elizabeth and her children were given space in a lean-to attached to the main house, with thin walls that did little to keep out the night chill. Each day, Isabel found fault with the children. Samuel was too loud, Margaret too slow to help with chores. Elizabeth tried to make herself useful, taking on the heaviest work without complaint, hoping to earn their keep until she could find a way forward. "I thought perhaps I might speak with the settlement council," Elizabeth ventured one evening as they ate a meager supper, "about claiming a parcel of land nearby." William and Isabel exchanged glances. "Land around here is mostly claimed already," William said. "Good land, anyway." "I have some money saved," Elizabeth said. "Not much, but enough for a small start." Another glance between husband and wife. Something unspoken passed between them. Actually, William said slowly, there might be something. Piece of land about 3 miles out, nobody's claimed it yet. Hope fluttered in Elizabeth's chest. Is it good for farming? William shrugged. It's land. Might need some work, but it's there for the taking. 3 days later, William loaded Elizabeth and her children into his wagon. They brought what few possessions they had: clothing, some cookware, Daniel's old rifle with precious few bullets, and the small pouch of coins Elizabeth kept hidden inside her dress. William added a few basic supplies: flour, salt, some dried beans, and a couple of worn tools. This is mighty kind of you, Elizabeth said as they traveled, though a growing unease settled in her stomach as they moved further from the settlement. William grunted. Family's family. The land William finally showed them was in a shallow valley far from any visible water source. The soil looked poor, with more rocks than good earth. A hastily constructed lean-to stood at one edge, barely more than some branches propped against a large rock and covered with canvas. This is it? Elizabeth couldn't keep the disappointment from her voice. Best available, William said shortly. Isabel and I will be back tomorrow with more supplies. Just get yourselves settled for now. Elizabeth watched in growing alarm as William unloaded their meager possessions quickly, barely taking time to ensure everything was clear of the wagon. William, I'm not sure. You wanted land. He cut her off. This is land. Make do like the rest of us have to. With that, he climbed back onto the wagon seat and flicked the reins. The wagon lurched forward, leaving Elizabeth and her children standing amid their small pile of belongings. He's coming back tomorrow, right, Ma? Samuel asked, watching the wagon grow distant. Elizabeth nodded, not trusting her voice. She had seen the truth in William's eyes just before he turned away. They had been abandoned. As the wagon disappeared from sight, 7-year-old Margaret began to cry softly. Elizabeth pulled her daughter close, while Samuel stood rigid, his young face already hardening with the knowledge that they had been betrayed. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across their new home. Elizabeth looked at the poor lean-to, the rocky soil, and the distant horizon with no sign of water. She allowed herself one moment of despair before straightening her shoulders. Samuel, help me gather more branches. Margaret, collect smaller sticks for a fire. We need to strengthen this shelter before dark. Her children moved to obey, their faces solemn but determined. As Elizabeth began reinforcing their crude shelter, she fought back tears. William wasn't coming back tomorrow, or ever. She knew that with certainty now. They were alone in this wilderness, 3 days from the nearest settlement, with barely enough supplies to last a week. The first star appeared in the darkening sky. Elizabeth paused in her work and looked up at it, making a silent promise to her children and to herself. They would survive this, somehow they would survive. 4 days passed since William left them on the barren plot of land. 4 days of Elizabeth stretching their meager supplies while trying to build a real shelter. The lean-to now had walls made of branches woven together, but it would not keep out rain if a storm came. Ma, I'm thirsty, Margaret said, her voice weaker than usual. Elizabeth touched her daughter's forehead. It felt warm. Too warm. She gave Margaret a small sip from their dwindling water supply. The nearest creek was almost a mile away, and the water there was muddy and still. Samuel, can you stay with your sister while I get more water? Elizabeth asked. The boy nodded solemnly. At 10 years old, Samuel had grown serious and quiet since their abandonment. He sat beside Margaret, placing a cool cloth on her head the way he had seen his mother do. I'll be back soon, Elizabeth promised, picking up their 2 water skins and the old pot. The walk to the creek seemed longer each time. Elizabeth's feet were blistered from the poor shoes she wore. When she reached the water, she frowned at its murky appearance. She had tried digging a small hole near the bank to filter the water, but it didn't help much. As she filled the containers, Elizabeth heard a twig snap behind her. She spun around, clutching the knife she kept in her apron. Pocket. The forest was quiet. Too quiet. No birds sang, no squirrels chattered. She quickly gathered the water and hurried back toward their camp. When she returned, Samuel was trying to start a fire with the flint her husband had carried. His small hands were scraped from striking the stones together. "Let me help," Elizabeth said, setting down the water. "Ma!" Margaret threw up, Samuel said quietly. Elizabeth rushed to her daughter's side. Margaret's face was flushed red, and her nightdress was damp with sweat. "She drank some of that water yesterday when you were fixing the roof," Samuel admitted, looking guilty. "I told her not to, but she was so thirsty." Elizabeth's heart sank. She had warned them about drinking water that hadn't been boiled. "The creek water must have made Margaret sick. It's not your fault," she assured Samuel, brushing his dark hair from his eyes. "Help me get the fire going so we can boil this water properly." That night, Margaret's fever grew worse. She shivered under the thin blanket they had brought from the wagon. Elizabeth placed cool cloths on her forehead and whispered songs from home, wishing desperately for medicine. The sound of howling woke Elizabeth before dawn. Wolves. Not too close yet, but closer than they had been before. Samuel was already awake, his eyes wide with fear. "They're just talking to each other," Elizabeth said, trying to sound confident. "They won't come near our fire." But the fire was low, just glowing embers now, and they were running out of wood nearby. Each day, Samuel had to go farther into the woods to find branches they could burn. "I need to find us food today," Elizabeth said as the sun rose. Their supplies of flour and beans were nearly gone. "And medicine for your sister." "I can help," Samuel insisted. "Pa showed me how to set snares for rabbits." Elizabeth hesitated. Samuel was just a boy, but she couldn't do everything alone. "All right," she agreed finally, "but stay where I can see you." Together they fashioned crude snares from twine and bent branches. Samuel placed them carefully along what looked like animal trails at the edge of the woods. Elizabeth watched him with a mixture of pride and sadness. No child should have to grow up so fast. By midday, one of the snares had caught a small rabbit. Elizabeth showed Samuel how to clean it, though her own hands trembled at the task. Her husband had always handled this part of hunting. The small animal would give them a meal and precious broth for Margaret. As the rabbit cooked over their fire, Elizabeth sorted through the wild plants she had gathered. She recognized dandelion leaves and some wild onions, but she was unsure about many of the other plants. In their home back east, she had kept a small herb garden, but the plants here were different. "Ma, look." Samuel pointed to the sky where dark clouds were gathering. Elizabeth felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cooling air. Their shelter would not keep out a heavy rain. Margaret's fever still burned, and now a storm was coming. "We need to reinforce the roof," she said, fighting down panic. "Samuel, help me gather more branches and leaves." They worked quickly, piling branches across the top of their lean-to and weaving in as many leafy boughs as they could find. Margaret watched them through glassy eyes, occasionally calling out in delirious confusion for her father. The first drops of rain fell as darkness approached. Elizabeth hurried to move their few possessions inside the shelter. The rabbit stew bubbled in the pot by the fire. She fed Margaret small spoonfuls of broth, praying it would help break the fever. Thunder rolled across the sky as the rain began to fall harder. Water soon found its way through the cracks in their makeshift roof. Elizabeth positioned their empty cooking pot to catch the largest drips and huddled with her children in the driest corner. "Tell us a story, Ma," Samuel whispered as the storm raged outside, "like the ones Pa used to tell." Elizabeth swallowed the lump in her throat and began a simple tale about brave pioneers. She had barely started when a terrible cracking sound split the air. One side of their shelter collapsed under the weight of the rain-soaked branches. Cold water poured in, drenching them. Margaret began to cough violently. "Get her out," Elizabeth shouted to Samuel over the storm. Together they dragged Margaret to the relatively dry space beneath the last standing section of their shelter. Elizabeth pulled off her shawl and draped it over her sick child, leaving herself exposed to the elements. "We can't stay here," Samuel said, his voice steady despite the fear in his eyes. Elizabeth knew he was right. The lean-to was falling apart. Around them, Margaret needed real shelter and medicine, but where could they go? The settlement was 3 days away on foot, and she couldn't carry Margaret that far. As the storm continued to batter their failing shelter, Elizabeth made a desperate decision. "Tomorrow I must find help," she said, pulling both children close, "or find a better place for us." "What if the wolves come back?" Samuel asked. Elizabeth glanced at Daniel's old rifle leaning against the wall. They had only 5 bullets left. "We'll be careful," she promised. "We'll stay together." Later that night, as Samuel finally drifted to sleep, Elizabeth remained awake, listening to the storm and her daughter's labored breathing. In the distance, she heard the wolves howling again. Closer now, perhaps drawn by the smell of the rabbit, bones. Elizabeth clutched her husband's hunting knife and stared into the darkness beyond their broken shelter. She had never felt so alone. Morning came with gray skies and mud everywhere. Elizabeth woke with a start, her neck stiff from sleeping upright. Margaret's breathing seemed worse, each breath a shallow rasp. Samuel was already awake, trying to rebuild their fire with damp wood. "I need to find dry kindling," he said, his young face serious. Elizabeth nodded. "Stay close to the camp, I'll check on the rabbit snares." She brushed Margaret's hair from her hot forehead. "I'll be right back, sweetheart." The storm had washed away one of their snares, but the second one held a small squirrel. It wasn't much, but it would provide another meal. As Elizabeth retrieved the animal, she noticed strange tracks in the mud. They were unlike any tracks she had seen before, too large for a fox or raccoon. When she returned to camp, Samuel was nowhere to be seen. "Samuel?" she called, trying to keep her voice calm. No answer came. The silence of the forest pressed in around her. Elizabeth laid down the squirrel and picked up Daniel's rifle, checking that it was loaded. "Samuel," she called again, louder this time. A rustling came from the trees to her right. Elizabeth raised the rifle, her hands shaking. Samuel emerged from the trees, his arms full of wood. "Ma, look what I found." Elizabeth lowered the gun, relief washing over her. "Don't wander off without telling me." "I wasn't far," Samuel insisted. "And look, I found dry wood under a fallen tree. And these too." He showed her a handful of berries, dark blue and clustered together. "Don't eat those," Elizabeth said quickly. "We don't know if they're safe." Samuel's face fell. "But I'm hungry." Elizabeth's heart ached. They were all hungry. The rabbit from yesterday had barely been enough for one meal. "I caught a squirrel," she said, gesturing to the small animal. "It will make a good stew." Samuel nodded, but his eyes lingered on the berries before he dropped them. As he arranged the dry wood for a fire, Elizabeth checked on Margaret. Her daughter's fever seemed no better, maybe even worse. By midday, they had a small fire going and a pot of water boiling for the squirrel stew. Elizabeth had added the last of their wild onions and some plants that looked like herbs. She hoped they would help Margaret's fever. "Ma," Samuel said suddenly, his voice quiet. "Someone's watching us." Elizabeth froze, then slowly turned toward where Samuel was looking. At first, she saw nothing. Then a shadow moved among the trees. "Get behind me," she whispered to Samuel, reaching again for the rifle. The figure stepped out from the trees. Elizabeth's finger tensed on the trigger. He was tall, with copper skin and long black hair pulled back with a leather strip. He wore buckskin clothing and carried a bow in one hand. His dark eyes took in their broken shelter, the small fire, and Margaret's still form. A Cheyenne warrior. Elizabeth had heard stories about the native tribes, mostly tales meant to frighten settlers. But the man before her didn't look threatening. He stood perfectly still, watching them with careful eyes. "Please," Elizabeth said, though she knew he probably couldn't understand her. "My daughter is sick." The man's gaze shifted to Margaret. He said something in his own language, the words strange to Elizabeth's ears. Then, to her surprise, he spoke in broken English. "Child sick?" Elizabeth nodded, lowering the rifle slightly. "Yes." She drank bad water. The warrior studied them for a long moment. He seemed to be making a decision. Finally, he pointed to himself. Swift River, he said. I'm Elizabeth, she replied. These are my children, Samuel and Margaret. Swift River nodded once. He gestured to the sad remains of their shelter, then to the forest around them. He shook his head. Bad place. No good for living. I know, Elizabeth admitted. But we have nowhere else to go. Swift River's eyes narrowed. Others leave you here? Elizabeth hesitated, then nodded. Swift River's face hardened. He said something in his own language that sounded angry. White man does this? Leaves woman and children to die? He spat on the ground. No honor. He looked at Margaret again, then made a motion like drinking. Child needs medicine. Water makes sick. Elizabeth felt a spark of hope. Can you help her? Swift River was silent for a moment, then nodded once. He gestured for them to wait and disappeared back into the forest. Samuel moved closer to his mother. Can we trust him, Ma? Elizabeth wasn't sure. Every story she had heard told her to fear native people, but Margaret was growing worse by the hour, and they had few options left. We don't have much choice, she said quietly. Less than an hour later, Swift River returned. He carried a small deerskin pouch and a bundle of plants. Without speaking, he knelt beside Margaret. Elizabeth watched nervously as he felt her daughter's forehead. Swift River mixed some dried leaves from his pouch with water in a small wooden cup he carried. He motioned for Elizabeth to lift Margaret's head. Drink, he said. Medicine help fever. Elizabeth hesitated only briefly before helping Margaret sip the bitter liquid. The little girl coughed, but swallowed most of it. Swift River then crushed different leaves between two stones and placed the paste on Margaret's forehead and chest. The sharp smell reminded Elizabeth of mint, but stronger. This helped breathing, he explained. As dusk approached, Swift River built up their fire and added strange-smelling wood that created a sweet smoke. He showed Samuel how to build a better shelter using branches in a different pattern that would shed rain. Why are you helping us? Elizabeth finally asked, as they sat by the fire. Swift River stared into the flames before answering. Many moons ago, White Trader helped Swift River when sick. Now Swift River help you. He pointed to the sky. Great Spirit sees all. We all people. That night, Margaret's breathing eased slightly. The medicine seemed to be working. Swift River remained with them, sitting alert by the fire. When wolves howled in the distance, he added more wood to the flames without comment. Elizabeth watched him from where she lay beside her children. She had been taught to fear people like Swift River. Yet here he was, helping strangers when her own kind had abandoned them. As she drifted to sleep, Elizabeth heard Samuel whisper to Swift River, "Those tracks I saw yesterday, were they wolf tracks?" "Yes," Swift River replied. "Wolf-pack hunting, but they fear fire, and they fear this." Elizabeth opened her eyes slightly to see Swift River show Samuel a strange marking carved on a piece of wood hanging from his belt. "Protection sign," he explained. "Keep away bad spirits. Keep away wolves, too." Samuel looked impressed. "Could you teach me to make one?" Swift River's face remained serious, but something like warmth flickered in his eyes. "Tomorrow," he promised. "First light. Now sleep." For the first time in days, Elizabeth felt a small sense of hope as she closed her eyes. They weren't alone anymore. 3 days passed with Swift River helping the small family. Margaret's fever broke on the second day. She was still weak, but her eyes were clear again, and she could keep down the broth Swift River made from herbs and a rabbit he had caught. "We cannot stay here," Swift River told Elizabeth as they watched the children sleep. "Bad land. No water good. Winter coming soon." Elizabeth looked around at the barren plot of land William had abandoned them on. She knew Swift River was right. They would not survive a winter here. "Where can we go?" she asked. "The settlement doesn't want us." Swift River was quiet for a moment. "Fort Larson. 2 days' walk. Army there. Maybe help widow woman and children." "Elizabeth, had heard of Fort Larson. It was a military outpost about 30 miles east. Settlers sometimes went there to trade or seek protection. "Will they help you too?" she asked. "For bringing us there?" Swift River's face hardened. "No. White soldiers not like my people now. Too much fighting." He pointed east. "I show you safe. Path, then go." The next morning they packed their few belongings. Elizabeth felt a strange sadness at leaving, though the place held nothing but bad memories. Samuel seemed excited about the journey, walking close to Swift River and watching everything the warrior did. "Look, Ma," Samuel said proudly, showing her a small wooden charm Swift River had helped him carve. "It's a protection sign like Swift River's." Margaret was still too weak to walk far, so Swift River fashioned a travois from branches in his buckskin shirt. They placed Margaret on it, and Swift River pulled it easily across the rough ground. Their journey was slow. Swift River led them along animal trails through the woods rather than using the wider paths. "Why don't we take the main trail?" Elizabeth asked after they had been walking for hours. "Not safe," Swift River replied. "Bad men sometimes, and soldiers sometimes shoot first, ask questions later. Better stay hidden." That night they camped in a small clearing. Swift River built a fire but kept it small and low. "No big fire," he explained. "Big fire seen far away." As they ate the jerky Swift River shared with them, Elizabeth asked him about his people. "My tribe camps near Black Ridge," he said, pointing west. "Good hunting there. Good water." "Why were you alone when you found us?" Samuel asked. Swift River's face grew solemn. "Vision quest. Young men of my tribe go alone. Seek wisdom from Great Spirit." He touched a small pouch at his waist. "Find medicine plants. Learn forest ways better." "Did you have a vision?" Margaret asked quietly. It was the most she had spoken since falling ill. Swift River looked at the little girl for a long moment. "Yes. Spirit of Bear, speak to me. Say help those in need." His eyes met Elizabeth's across the fire. "Then find you." Elizabeth felt a strange shiver run through her. Was it true? Had some vision really led this man to them, or was it just chance? Either way, she was grateful. The second day of travel was harder. The land began to rise, and Swift River led them up a steep hill. Margaret walked some of the way, but Swift River carried her when she grew tired. "Look," Swift River said when they reached the top of the hill. In the distance, Elizabeth could see the outline of buildings surrounded by a wooden wall. "Fort Larson. We reach by sunset," Swift River told them. As they descended the hill, Swift River grew more alert, often stopping to listen or examine the ground. Once he motioned for them to hide as a group of riders passed in the distance. "Soldiers," he explained after the riders had gone. "Patrol." By late afternoon they were within sight of the fort's walls. Swift River stopped at the edge of the forest. "I go no further," he said. "Fort not safe for me." Elizabeth felt a surge of panic. "We'll never make it inside without you." "They see women and children, they help," Swift River insisted. "I watch until you safe inside." Elizabeth knew he was right, but fear still gripped her. Swift River had been their protector for days now. The thought of facing the fort alone frightened her. Samuel seemed to sense her fear. He stood straighter and took Margaret's hand. "We'll be fine, Ma. Swift River taught me lots of things." Swift River nodded approvingly at the boy. He removed a small bundle from his pack and handed it to Elizabeth. "Medicine for girl, if fever comes back." He pointed to the different herbs wrapped in leaves. "This for tea, this for chest." Elizabeth took the bundle, fighting back tears. "How can I thank you?" Swift River shook his head. "No thanks needed. Great Spirit sees all." He knelt in front of Samuel. "You protect mother and sister now. Be brave like bear, smart like fox." Samuel nodded solemnly. "Will we see you again?" Swift River didn't answer directly. Instead, he touched the protection charm hanging around Samuel's neck. "Keep this. Remember forest ways I teach you. To Margaret, he gave a small pouch of dried berries. Sweet medicine, make strong. With those final gifts, Swift River melted back into the forest. Elizabeth watched the spot where he disappeared for a long moment, then turned toward the fort. "Come on, children," she said, taking a deep breath. "Let's go." The guards at the fort's gate were suspicious at first, but the sight of two small children, one still pale from illness, softened them. They were taken to the commander, a stern-faced man named Captain Frank Miller. "So you were abandoned by your relatives?" he asked, after Elizabeth explained their situation. "Yes, sir. My cousin William Mason left us on worthless land with almost no supplies." Captain Miller frowned. "Mason from Whispering Pines, we know him. Comes here to trade sometimes." His eyes narrowed. Not the most honest man in these parts. He offered them a small room normally used for storage and promised to ask the fort's doctor to look at Margaret. "We can give you shelter for a week or two," he said. "But this isn't a place for civilians long term, especially a woman with small children." That night, as Elizabeth tucked her children into the blankets provided by the fort, Samuel asked, "Is this our new home, Ma?" Elizabeth looked around at the bare wooden walls of the storage room. It was better than the lean-to in the wilderness, but it wasn't a home. "No," she said softly. "Just a stopping place. We'll find a real home soon." Later, as the children slept, Elizabeth stood by the small window. In the distance, she thought she saw a flicker of movement at the forest's edge. She raised her hand, slightly, wondering if Swift River was still watching over them. "Thank you," she whispered to the night. A week passed at Fort Larson. Elizabeth and her children were given food and shelter, but she knew they couldn't stay much longer. The fort was crowded, and Captain Miller had made it clear their welcome was limited. On the 8th day, Elizabeth sat on a bench outside the storage room, watching Samuel play with some of the soldiers' children. Margaret sat beside her, looking much healthier than she had in weeks. "Mrs. Mason?" A young soldier approached her. "Captain wants to see you." Elizabeth followed him to the main building where Captain Miller waited. To her surprise, he wasn't alone. A woman in a plain brown dress stood beside him. "Mrs. Mason, this is Clara Bennett," the captain said. "She runs the trading post 5 miles from here with her husband." Clara stepped forward, her kind eyes taking in Elizabeth's worn dress and tired face. "Captain Miller told me about your situation. My husband and I could use some help at our trading post. We have a small cabin out back that's empty." Elizabeth couldn't believe what she was hearing. "You'd give us a place to stay?" Clara nodded. "And fair pay for your work. I heard you're good with a needle, and heaven knows I could use help with the mending. Your boy could help my husband with the stock, and your little girl would be company for my daughter." It seemed too good to be true. Elizabeth looked at Captain Miller, who nodded slightly. "The Bennetts are good people," he confirmed. "Known them for years." That afternoon, Elizabeth told her children about the offer. Samuel was excited about the idea of working at a trading post. Margaret seemed happy at the prospect of having another child to play with. "When do we leave?" Samuel asked. "Tomorrow morning," Elizabeth told him. "Mr. Bennett is coming with a wagon." That night, Elizabeth couldn't sleep. The offer from the Bennetts was generous, but something kept her awake. She stood by the window, looking out at the dark forest beyond the fort walls. Somewhere out there was Swift River. She wondered if she would ever see him again. In the morning, Peter Bennett arrived with his wagon. He was a friendly man with a thick beard and calloused hands. He helped them load their few belongings and introduced himself to the children. "My wife's been talking about nothing else since she heard about you folks," he said cheerfully to Elizabeth. "Been lonely for her out at the post with just me and our Annie for company." The trading post was a sturdy log building sitting beside the main trail. Behind it stood the Bennett's home and a smaller cabin that would be theirs. Elizabeth felt a wave of relief at the sight of it. It wasn't grand, but it looked solid and dry. Clara welcomed them warmly, introducing her 8-year-old daughter Annie, who immediately took Margaret by the hand to show her the chickens they kept. Life at the trading post quickly fell into a pattern. Elizabeth helped Clara with cooking and sewing. Samuel worked with Peter, learning to care for the horses and unload supplies. Margaret regained her strength playing with Annie. For the first time since Daniel's death, Elizabeth felt they might have found a place where they could build a new life. 3 weeks after they arrived, Elizabeth was hanging laundry behind the cabin when she noticed movement at the edge of the forest. Her heart jumped when she recognized the tall figure of Swift River. He stood watching her, not approaching. Elizabeth glanced toward the trading post to make sure no one was watching, then walked toward him. "Swift River," she said quietly. "You're here," he nodded once. "Came to see if children well, if you well." "We are, thanks to you." She told him about the Bennetts and their new life at the trading post. Swift River listened without speaking. When she finished, he seemed pleased. "Good people here," he said. "I know them. They trade fair with my people." "You know the Bennetts?" Elizabeth was surprised. "Yes. They not afraid of Cheyenne. Treat all people same." He pointed to a distant hill. "My people camp there now. Good hunting this season." Elizabeth felt a strange mix of emotions. "Will you visit again?" Swift River was quiet for a moment. "Maybe. When safe." His eyes met hers. "Wanted to show you something, if you trust." Elizabeth hesitated only briefly before nodding. "I trust you." Swift River led her into the forest, not far from the trading post. They walked for about 20 minutes before emerging into a small valley hidden between two hills. A clear stream ran through it, and the soil looked rich and dark. "Good land," Swift River said. "Good water, hidden from main trails. Safe place." Elizabeth looked around in wonder. "It's beautiful." "No one claimed this land," Swift River told her. "White men not see value because hidden. But good place for home." Elizabeth understood what he was offering. "You think we could live here?" Swift River nodded. "Build cabin here. Plant food when spring comes. Hidden valley keeps safe from bad people." The possibility of having their own land, their own home, made Elizabeth's heart race, but it seemed impossible. "I have no money to buy land," she said. "No way to build a cabin." "Land free if you claim it," Swift River said. "I help build cabin. My people help too." He looked at her seriously. "You helped my sister when sick last winter. Bennetts tell me. Now I help you." Elizabeth was confused. "I never met your sister." "At trading post, woman with sick baby. You give medicine, give food." Swift River smiled slightly. "Morning star not forget kindness." Elizabeth remembered a native woman who had come to the trading post a week ago. She had been exhausted, carrying a small child. Elizabeth had shared her food and some of the medicine Swift River had given her for Margaret. "That was your sister?" Swift River nodded. Circle of giving, never broken. 2 months later, as the first snow fell, Elizabeth stood in the doorway of their new cabin in the hidden valley. Behind her, Samuel and Margaret slept on the beds Peter Bennett had helped them build. The walls were solid logs, the roof tight against the weather. A small corral held 2 goats given to them by Clara, and a stack of firewood would see them through winter. The Bennetts visited regularly, bringing supplies from the trading post. Elizabeth still worked for Clara, sewing clothes that Peter sold to travelers. Samuel had learned to hunt from Swift River, bringing home rabbits and sometimes a deer with the bow the warrior had made for him. Margaret had grown stronger. She spent her days learning plant lore from Morning Star, who often brought her small son to play with the children. As Elizabeth watched the snow falling on their small clearing, she thought of William and his cruel abandonment. That act, meant to destroy them, had instead led them here, to this peaceful valley and these kind people. Swift River appeared from the trees, carrying more firewood. He nodded to Elizabeth as he stacked it carefully against the cabin wall. "Winter, come early," he said. "But you ready now?" "Thanks to you," Elizabeth replied. Swift River shook his head. "No. Your strength bring you here. You survive when others would die. You trust when others would fear." He looked at the cabin with approval. Now you have home, children have future. As they stood together watching the snow, Elizabeth felt a sense of peace she hadn't known since Daniel died. This hidden valley, somewhere between two worlds, had become their sanctuary. And the man beside her, once a stranger from a people she had been taught to fear, had become family. "Come inside," she said. "Supper's almost ready." And together they stepped into the warmth of the cabin, closing the door against the winter cold.